Tony Stark is an often disrespectful, arrogant billionaire and certainly an asshole to many people on his social circle. So, if that's the case, how can we so naturally get attached to his character and care so much about his journey of personal growth? That, of course, without being expelled from the narrative by the possible disgust of a person like that. In this video, I will analyze how, in the first act of his first film, the character is introduced and what narrative techniques are used to make us sympathize with this guy, and not only that, but actively root for his success. So let's get started. The movie begins inside a military vehicle, followed by a military escort in the middle of the desert with a man in a suit holding his drink alongside a group of soldiers. Already here the film is being very clever because what a narrative needs the most at the beginning is to hold your attention, convince you to continue watching and keeping your investment in this experience. And one method to try to generate this initial interest is curiosity. What is a guy in a suit with a drink in his hand doing in the middle of the desert, walking alongside several soldiers? And guess what? Having the audience ask questions about the film is positive for them. So, I guess I caught your attention. You wanna know what's going on, right? But guess what? If that's the case, you have to keep watching. And the good thing is that it doesn't stop there, because this initial question is not answered right away, because the characters simply just starts talking about topics that don't answer your initial question. It is an interesting detail that even the soldiers in the scene act like the audience, finding it completely strange, this out-of-character figure. And given the fact, Tony starts to recognize how uncomfortable the atmosphere is, and he starts to break the ice of the crowd by making jokes and establishing himself as part of the group. Again, imagine the film talking to you and saying, okay, I still haven't given enough reasons for you to want to continue watching my movie, right? How about this protagonist with witty phrases, humorous attitude, and at the same time dominant personality within a circle? And in this small exchange of words from the opening scene of the film, we can already see several of Tony's main characteristics that are repeated throughout the film. Every question he receives or answer that he gives is automatically subverted, having its meaning reinterpreted to something completely different from what was intended. And this is when he himself doesn't just simply choose to change the subject to something that he finds more interesting. For example, if no one there is forbidden to speak but they are all silent anyway, then Tony sarcastically pretends to judge it as a personal grudge that everyone has against him. If a woman in the car suggests that everyone is quiet because he intimidates them, rather than just staying on topic and answer her response, he prefers to change the subject to the fact that there is a woman in the car and how out of the ordinary it is such a fact. And if a guy asks, in a shy manner, if it would be cool to take a picture with him, in the sense that if it wouldn't be annoying, Tony distorts the meaning of the question on purpose to simply answer, yes, it would be cool. Not to mention the fact that here at the beginning we already have a reference to how much of a womanizer Tony is. Oh, so you wanna know if I slept with all the models of each month of a certain men's magazine? Yes and no, since the Miss March and I had a mismatch due to our schedules, but luckily the December cover models were twins. This, my friends, is a good character introduction. In a few seconds you may not even know who he is, what he does, or why he's in the middle of the desert followed by a military convoy. But the guy is intriguing. His dialogues are sharp and you can already be sure that following a scene where he is inserted will hardly be monotonous. Adds the fact that this sequence isn't over yet, as the convoy is attacked and the protagonist is captured. And again, in small subtle details, more exposition is given to the audience without us barely noticing it. Because during the attack, for the first time in the film, one of the soldiers speaks the name of said fancy man while shouting to one of his friends, "Jimmy, protect Mr. Stark!" But why this type of exposition is so good, you ask? Because the revelation of his name makes sense that it would happen only now in a moment of crisis, and because it's completely plausible for one soldier to clarify his orders to the other. Not to mention that it is also functional for the narrative, since soon after that, when trying to escape, Tony ends up being hit by a bomb with a certain logo written on it. And look how ironic. In it was written Stark Industries. Get it now? A name name introduced in a quick phrase only to moments later serve as a link to the visual information contained written in the bomb. Just fantastic. Oh, and did I forget to mention how Tony, when suffering an enemy attack, immediately asks for a weapon and, when he fails to get it, runs out of the car and rushes to try and use his phone to call for rescue and reinforcements. And to that I just gotta say that I've heard before that conflict reveals character. After all, it is at times when they have to make decisions that we actually know who's who. And here we increasingly discover important details about this guy and are fed little by little with a good and well-seasoned cinematic meal. Tony is then captured by some random terrorist, and this is where the prologue ends. And man, I gotta say, the movie starts pretty damn good, not only giving little hints for what's to come, who will be the focus of our narrative, what's the initial conflict that he will have to face, and what is the general tone of the piece. Not to mention that looking ahead, knowing what the film is about, this beginning has a very good meta-linguistic conversation between the fact that Tony is a weapons supplier, and at the same time, he ends up suffering the consequences of his productions. And even if you don't use the entire work as a reference, right here at the beginning, when one of the soldiers goes to take a picture with him and puts a little peace sign, Tony mocks the symbol and says sarcastically, "Yeah, peace. I love peace. I would be out of a job with peace." Only to literally seconds later be affected by this lack of peace that he himself helps to construct. So now, with all of my inspection of the opening scene closed, let's see a beautiful example of how the movie could have started and luckily didn't. I'm referring, of course, to the award scene. Because remember, our little show in the desert is the beginning of the movie, but it is not chronologically the beginning of the story of the protagonist. The first chronological scene of the film is this one, where Rhodes is supposed to deliver an award to Tony, but he's not there. And why not start the film right here, I ask? After all, just to recap, we have a narration scene telling the whole story of Tony and even explaining his origins and acting market. Much of what we need to know about him and the film's main villain is already present here. So why break the film's chronology and not merely reassemble the scenes in order to play the desert one further into the work? And the answer is very simple, my friends. Exposition and interest. In my opinion, these are the key words here. This award scene by itself is very weak. It lacks the subtlety and the ingenuity of the initial. Because here the first thing we get is a blunt narration telling us everything that Tony Stark cares about. They talk about his past, his aptitudes. They present part of their closest people, and all of this with big words and few actions. Seriously. The first time we see Rhodes in the movie is in his speech about how honored he is to meet, work, and be friends with Tony. But this has little to no impact on the audience because we don't even know this guy or how is his relationship with the protagonist. It's a very functional scene for a narrative that dumps everything that needs to be said to get rid of the obligation to convey certain information in a good manner, and that's why it does it so badly. The merits that I can point to here are very few, and perhaps the most relevant compliment I can offer is the cut. The moment we move from the award show, with Obadiah having to take over the event, to meeting the movie star betting in a casino, ironically right when his partner was talking about how dedicated and hardworking the guy is. So that's why, in addition to the desert scene being more interesting as it brings evidence of the protagonist's characteristics through his actions, it also plays a very important role in establishing the film's identity, as I mentioned before. Because it's obvious that seeing Tony in the casino is a complement of the award scene. But if it started there, we would already have the opening of the story asking the viewer to tolerate narrative crap in favor of an attempt to introduce the protagonist. Even if soon after he appears with all his charisma, practically making fun of all that silly ceremony, we are still able to perceive part of the malice of the script that asks us earnestly to ignore the fact that so much important information was given in the film through such an expository narration. And not only that, but one crucial element is also missing here: the moment of action. Even in the casino and after it, we don't have a new action scene for many minutes into the movie, and that would be a big problem for not being there at the beginning, because then you would hardly establish the kind of grip your movie wants to have. Having this already in the desert scene, we open the door in the viewer's head to be aware of more shows of adrenaline like this to come, because this movie is not a drama or a comedy about this billionaire's personal life, at least not only that, but also the story of how he becomes a hero shooting down terrorists. But what about the rest of the beginning? The casino scene shows gambling, drinking, women, and a total lack of commitment and seriousness from Tony about the embarrassment he left his supposed friend Roz. On the one hand, the irony of this cut complements Tony's presentation very well, which at this point is no longer an introduction but actually a reinforcement of everything we've seen so far. And it kinda seems like the movie understands that, because just when the narrative flows starts to get very repetitive, we have some good new dialogue that allows us to permeate even more into this fantastic Stark character. Because the conversation with the reporter now presents us with Tony's view of his business and, in a very detailed way, some of his triggers. He starts off by answering her questions in a very jocular way, just by flirting and playing every time he sees an opportunity. But as the reporter remains steadfast in her political questions, he starts to take the conversation a little more seriously and gets even slightly irritated by her comments. Her goal is basically to get a reaction from him through the accusations for profit on the war, painting him kinda like a merchant of death. In response, Tony explains his worldview in different ways, conveying the idea that weapons are necessary to keep the peace, and this is basically a philosophy that was taught to him through his father. And that's kinda where the reporter tries to corner him, because the question she brings is also about the fact that said weapons are sold to both sides. And since this comment also refers to his father, it kinda sounded like an insult to Tony's old man. And since our protagonist kinda have his father as a role model, then ultimately it feels like an insult to his morality. From that point on, Stark kinda stops to have the fun that he was having before and starts to talking more seriously about how all of his philanthropic projects are also financed by his military ones, including development in medicine and agriculture. And it's at this point that the argument ends, because without answer, the last try of the reporter is only to ask if he ever lost some sleep due to his actions, to which he, realizing that he has won the argument, goes back to the flirtation, answers simply, "I would be prepared to lose some with you." And I gotta say, Tony's every dialogue is like a dance step. It's unpredictable, fluid, intelligent. He doesn't just answer a question, he gives it his own flavor, his personal frame, controlling the dynamics of the interaction. When at the end of the conversation we see him taking her to the bed, it's definitely not surprising that he is really capable of doing it. As much as the beginning of the film suggests that he is a womanizer, simply for saying that he slept with some models from a magazine, presenting this in a practical scene is what makes the trait really palpable. In this way, we have now well established who the protagonist is, and if we were to stop the analysis here, what could be our conclusions? The guy is arrogant, at times disrespectful for his lack of commitment and seriousness, as well as a highly inconsequential individual. And as the movie continues, the characteristics are only reinforced, such as from the fact that he leaves Rose waiting 3 hours for his arrival, or simply by the fact that he dismissed the reporter the very next day without even looking at her face. What we can take away that is new and useful for the proposal of what makes us like Tony Stark is his relationship with Pepper, who so far is the only character he seems to have the slightest respect for. But even that relationship is unclear, if it is due to the fact that he really has her in a higher degree of importance than the others, or if it is the simple fact that she is firm about his advances, as shown in this initial first scene they shared together. On the outside, it looks like the rest of the people around are like toys that entertain him for a while, but that he could simply discard given the right replacement. For example, if Rhodes got fired or Obadiah retired, from what we see in this beginning, it doesn't seem like Tony would suffer more than a simple, "Yeah, it's a shame, they are gone, but hey, who do I work with now?" And well, that, of course, are the impressions I got before the initial event took place, because once Tony is captured, his construction construction process can continue, and here we can see more elements that connect us better to him. Tony is placed in a victim position, and this is one way we can empathize a lot with any kind of person, given the fact that most of us simply have some degree of kindness in our little hearts. That's why when seeing others suffering, even though the problems in question are not directly with us, they can still affect the audience emotionally to the point where we can end up putting ourselves in the person's place and afterwards creating a minimal affection for them given their uncomfortable situation. Soon after, he meets his savior, and the two already starts developing a good friendly relationship while the plot goes on to explain what was the reason for all of this mess. And how ironic. It turns out that Tony's actions towards supplying weapons to both sides of the war have now led him to become a literal slave to his job, being forced to produce these very same weapons for his newest enemies. But as presented at the beginning of the film, this guy is not the type to cooperate easily. And after a light-wet incentive in the form of torture, he even accepts working for the guys, but of course with a certain disclaimer in his head. And that's with a little speech from his newest friend about how he can't let this be his legacy. Tony decides to put a certain plan in place. In this way, Iron Man actually begins to be created, including his new heart, that, symbolically, will have an interesting metaphorical meaning as the movie progresses. The guy known as the Merchant of Death literally having an iron heart, a weapon. If they want Tony to wreak havoc, then he will, but this time with a little twist. As he forges his armor, metaphorically he also forges his new character, little by little exchanging ideas with Yinsen and being convinced of a new perspective on life by this new and so far only real friend in the movie. And as a character, Yinsen here is very important. He serves as an ear for the audience to have a way to talk to Tony as well as bringing the most key moments of the protagonist to be open. He is the one who makes Tony wonders if he has someone to return to. And also he is the one who motivates him to come up with a plan to get out of the cave, and he's the one who encourages a new legacy to be created for the protagonist. And while doing so, creating a very good chemistry between the two. Where I see that his friendship is actually put to test is when the supposed villain of the movie is introduced. And to protect Yinsen from the rage that the terrorist has regarding the delay in delivering the missile, Tony advocates in defense of his companion, where, at this exact point, the friendship of the two is finally fostered in an indirect way. And it's not like Tony wouldn't do the same thing for anyone else, but given the context, this moment is indeed about the new duo that has been formed. Do you understand what I mean? A guy can be the biggest asshole, arrogant, womanizing, and irresponsible person you ever knew. But if he shows you a little of good traits like empathy, bravery, and wit, there's no way to escape. He will be seen with good eyes. And that's how his mission now draws to an end. Both perform their final acts in the escape plan, having Yinsen sacrifice himself to buy Tony some time as he later goes to his friend's rescue. Unfortunately now, a little too late. And sadly here I feel that Yinsen's act was kind of forced, since he later says that his death was part of the plan. After Tony killing almost everybody in the cave, he and Yinsen have one last conversation where the guy says he will finally find his family, which was mentioned earlier. And I mean, man, if his plan was to die from the beginning, then why hadn't he, I don't know, killed himself before? Why did he choose death only now that he's going to save Tony? Did he know that Tony was a terrorist target? Why he only stayed alive until the moment he needed to help the protagonist? And now that he did, he accepts his death happily? It kind of feels like a weak argument to me, I don't know. But at least the scene feeds us with this idea that he implants in Tony's head, which is, don't waste your life. And putting that together with all the other moments the two spend together, having Tony be reminded that he has no one significant in his life and be essentially alone, here we have it. This first act of Tony Stark's character is complete. The conclusion of a new man who will now move his life towards his new purpose. This is how all of these moments and little tips are encouraged. And finally, we have this last act of construction as a reward. That's why we like this billionaire. Because as much as he has several flaws or just characteristics that can generate us repulsion, he is still, in essence, a moral man, a good person. Someone willing to look at himself and rethink his his actions after living the consequences in first hand. It is a bad thing for him to be captured and wounded by his own weapons, but even worse for him to see these weapons wounding this one who had become his great friend and savior, a good-hearted man who now is dead. Tony then destroys the terrorist weaponry, escapes the battlefield, and proceeds with the film to complete the journey that, in this first act, was suggested. No longer as a merchant of death, but as a hero. That's why I say that the beginning of this film is extremely excellent in convincing the viewer to embark on this journey, because as much as the director knows that the protagonist has problematic characteristics, he cares to make clear his positive deeds and reasons for recognizing Tony Stark as a person of which is worth rooting for. Thanks for watching my video, and until next time.